I just got a second COVID vaccine. It really makes you wonder, where did this virus come from anyway? The origin of the COVID-19 pandemic is one of the biggest questions at the present time. The leading contenders are bat soup at a wet market in Wuhan and the Wuhan Institute for Virology. The latter hypothesis was labeled as a conspiracy theory until, well, some scientists began to actually take it seriously. Also, Jon Stewart endorsed it, so it must be mainstream now, I guess. The point of this video is not to solve the question, but to think about how we should think about it. Namely, I want to pick apart the argument that the pandemic started near a virology institute, ergo it came from that virology institute. Couldn't you make the exact same argument about it starting near a wet market, so it must have come from a wet market? Also, is this really a smoking gun level of evidence? We'll find it out in this video with a little help from our good friend, Thomas Bayes. There are dozens of labs around the world designated as Biosafety Level 4, being the ones which handle the most dangerous pathogens on Earth. A quick back-of-the-envelope calculation leads me to estimate that about 139 million humans live in a city near one of these institutes, with a global population of about 7.8 billion, and assuming the pandemic will start in one individual uniformly at random across the Earth, then the probability that the pandemic begins near such a research lab by dumb luck, that is not via a lab leak or anything else, is about 1.8%, which is small enough to raise an eyebrow. And it may look like evidence that the virus came from a lab. However, that's not the probability that we want to calculate. Consider, for example, the weather. We may want to know the probability that it's going to rain. If we were to see our neighbor walking down the street carrying an umbrella, that may signal to us that rain is coming, with some heightened probability. But if our neighbor also likes to carry his umbrella on oppressively hot sunny days, then observing an umbrella may also raise the probability of a very hot sunny day. Ultimately, we'll need to account for both of these scenarios as well as the background probability of rain and sun to make sense of the evidence. In the context of COVID, what we want is the conditional or posterior probability that the virus came from either a wet market or a lab, given that it started in the city of Wuhan, a city that contains both a wet market and a virus lab. Asking for some guidance from Thomas Bayes, we can use Bayes' theorem to write this probability as the probability that the pandemic were to start in Wuhan given either the wet market or the lab leak hypothesis times the prior probability of the given hypothesis divided by the probability that the pandemic would start in Wuhan under any scenario. Now, we have to fill in these probabilities. First, let's consider priors. A prior is a probability that a hypothesis is true before the data is collected. For example, it may rain 3 out of every 10 days. In the case of COVID, both scenarios seem equally plausible at this time, a statement that will neither satisfy nor upset everyone watching. Hence, I'll assign 40% chances to each of the main hypotheses, with 20% reserved for the dumb luck hypothesis. Someone had to start it, and by dumb luck, that poor person was in Wuhan. Second, we need the probability of the pandemic starting in Wuhan under each hypothesis. For lab leak, if we assume that COVID came from some lab, then if there are about 40 such biosafety level 4 labs in the world, we could say that the probability that Wuhan was the unlucky one is 1 in 40. Meanwhile, the probability of COVID starting in Wuhan given it came from a wet market, let's say there are about 2 billion people in China and Southeast Asia where wet markets containing creatures like pangolins and bats, the candidates for COVID, are prevalent. Again, these are just rough numbers, but of those 2 billion people, about 11 million live near or in the city of Wuhan. So to make things easy, let's just say there's about a 1 in 200 chance that the wet market in Wuhan was the unlucky one out of all such candidate wet markets. Lastly, the probability of COVID starting in Wuhan by dumb luck, we'll just set that to be 1 in 780 based on the population of the city and the population of the world. Now let's put all of this together. At the bottom, we have the dumb luck hypothesis, whose posterior probability is 2.1%. Next up, we have the wet market hypothesis, whose posterior is a more respectable 16.3%. And lastly, the lab leak comes in with a very nice posterior probability of 81.6%. Does that mean that COVID definitely came from a lab? Of course not. One, I just took educated guesses at all of these numbers, i.e., I made them up. Two, even if we were to take these numbers as truth, it just means that lab leak is more probable than wet market given this evidence. I'm more likely to roll a 7 than a 2 in a game of craps doesn't mean rolling a 2 is impossible. In the end, the point is not to definitely answer the COVID origin question. It's to learn how to think about the impact of evidence for or against a given hypothesis. There are people vehemently supporting all sorts of COVID hypotheses. It's our job to calmly weigh the evidence provided. Thanks for listening, and here's a list of all the other posterior probabilities not included thus far in this video. Enjoy!